Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide where I'm going to be showing you how to fit all these parts into the Phanteks Evolv XT. Taking a look at the other parts I've chosen for today's build. For the motherboard I'm going to be using the ASUS ROG STRIX Z690 iGaming Wi-Fi. For the CPU I'm going to be using Intel's 12th Gen i7, the 12700K. Keeping our CPU cool, I'm going to be using a 240mm AIO from Cooler Master. It's their MasterLiquid PL240 Flux. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 at 5200 MHz. For storage, I'm going with a single Gen 4 NVMe drive from Sabrent. It's the Rocket 4 Plus in 2TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got a 750W Platinum SFX power supply from Seasonic. It's their Focus SPX 750. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the Zotac Gaming RTX 3070 Ti AMP Holo. Okay, that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. The first thing for us to do is to get into the case. This panel is held on magnetically, so it can simply be pulled away. We've got two little clips, one here and one here, so we just need to push them in towards the middle. We can now slide the top of the case forward and lift it away. On each side of the case we've got this mesh panel. It is held on rails, so it can simply be slid upwards and away. Same thing on the other side. At the rear of the case we have a thumb screw to remove. We're then able to slide the main body of the case forward and lift it away. On the top of the case we've got a removable fan stroke radiator bracket. It's held on with two screws. The top bracket is on hinges on this side, so with the screws removed it can be lifted up, and if you want to remove it you just need to slide it forward and lift away. With the panels removed we can take a closer look at the case and we'll see we've got a sandwich style layout. So on this side we're going to install our mini ITX motherboard, we've got our Gen 4 riser cable, and our SFX or SFXL power supply is going to go here. On the other side of the case we're going to install our graphics card, and we can fit pretty large graphics cards up to 324mm in length. We've also got the extension cable for our power supply, and we've got a single 2.5-inch drive mounting location at the bottom. I'm not planning on installing a 2.5-inch drive in this build, however if you want to do one it should be fairly straightforward to do. To remove the drive tray, all we're going to want to do is slide it this way, and then we just need to pull it away from the holes. You're going to mount your 2.5-inch drive into here. There's screw holes at the side for mounting it, and then to put it back into place all you're going to do is slide it back into here and again push this way, and the little rubber pads and screws are going to hold it in place. At the rear of the case you can see we've got 3 vertical expansion slots, and we've got the pass-through from our power supply cable. Taking a look at the front of the case, we've got an infinity mirror here with ARGB effects on it, and we've got our power button here down at the bottom of the case. You might be wondering where our front I/O is, and it's hidden beneath this panel. We just need to slide it upwards, and then you'll see we've got a single USB Type-C and a single USB Type-A port. We've also got 2 buttons here, one to control the color and the other to control the mode of the infinity mirror, and also anything else you plug into the case's ARGB extender cable. Taking a look at what you get in the case's 2 accessory boxes, so we've got our instruction manual, we've got a quick start guide and some RMA information. We've got some cable ties, we've got a lock for our riser cable, a Phanteks badge and a range of screws. I'm not going to go through these screws individually, but there's a nice diagram in the manual which tells you which screws to use where. We've got 2 panels to convert the case's layout from the default compact to either air boost or liquid cooled mode. And we've got a short screwdriver. I'll show you why we need this later on. We've also got some dust filters for the top of the case which are optional. There's double-sided adhesive on the other end to stick them into place. And just be careful, this is the packaging that the dust filters come in. It's very easy to throw this out with all the other packaging in the case. So by default the case comes in compact mode. In this mode you're going to have to go with an Air CPU cooler up to a maximum height of 72mm. You're not going to be able to install any additional fans, and you're not going to be able to use an AIO. If that doesn't sound like enough cooling for you, we're going to have to convert the top of the case to use it in air boost mode or water cooled mode. So we'll start off with air boost mode, where we're going to have to use the smaller panel from the accessory box. So we've got rails on either side of our top panel, so all we need to do is line the little bit of plastic up with the rails and then push it down into place. Then we're going to want to use 2 of these small screws with a flat head to secure the panel to the case. At the front of our top panel, we've got 3 screw mounting locations, and the screw is installed at the bottom here for compact mode. For air boost mode, we're going to need to remove the screw on each side and put it into the middle slot. In air boost mode, we're going to be able to install either 2 140 or 2 120mm fans at the top, ideally set to exhaust. We can then replace the top panel. So that's what the case is going to look like in air boost mode. To use the case in water cooled mode, this time we're going to have to slide in the larger panel from the accessory box. And this time we're going to want to move the 2 screws at the front up to the top slot. As you can see, I've already done this. At the top of the case now, in water cooled mode, we're going to be able to fit a 240mm AIO, and I'll show you how to do this during the build. And if we replace the top panel, this should give you an idea what the case looks like in water cooled mode. We're now ready to start work on the motherboard, and we're going to install our CPU, the bracket for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD and our RAM before we put the motherboard into the case. To install our CPU, we need to open the slot by pushing the lever out and upwards, and then we can open the cover. We can insert our CPU into the socket with the text up the correct way, lining the notches at the top and the bottom up with the CPU. Once we're happy everything's lined up, we can close the cover down. If we apply a little bit of pressure here, the bit of black plastic will pop off, and I'm going to put that into the motherboard box. And then we can close the lever down to secure our CPU in place. To install our M.2 SSD, we're going to need to remove the heatsink. It's held on with 2 screws. If you're using the motherboard for the first time, you're going to have some plastic protection here and also the underside of the heatsink to remove. We can then insert our drive into the socket at a slight angle, flatten it down, and then we've got a little clip here we can close to secure the drive in place. And then we can replace the heatsink. We're now ready to install the RAM, so I'm going to open the clips on both slots. I'm going to line the RAM up with the slot. Once I'm happy I've got everything lined up, I'm just going to apply some firm pressure, and the RAM is going to clip into place. And then same thing with our second stick. Then we can install the backplate for our CPU cooler, and then we've got one of these standoffs to go on each corner. We can now set the motherboard into the case, line it up with the standoffs at the back. We're then going to use 4 of these screws with a little lip around the outside to secure it into place. We can then open the clip in the motherboard's PCIe slot. We can remove the plastic protection from our riser cable, line the riser cable up with the slot. Then once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure to secure the riser cable into the slot. And then we can install the riser cable lock. Next thing to do is get some of our front panel connectors plugged in. So starting off with our power switch, which is just going to go into this header here, just at the top left hand side. Then we've got our USB 3.0 cable. Line it up and push into place. And our front panel Type-C connector, which is going to go into here. Taking a look at our other front panel connectors, we've got a 3-pin 5V ARGB connector, and you're going to plug this into the ARGB header on your motherboard if you want your motherboard to control the ARGB lighting on the case. If you want the case to control it, don't plug this in, because once you plug this in, the buttons in the front of the case to cycle through the ARGB effects won't work. I'm going to let the case control the lighting. The other nice thing that we have is we have additional ARGB header here, so we take this bit of covering off. We've got another header here, so we can plug our cooler into here, and the case buttons are going to control all the RGB effects. The other connection we've got here is for Phanteks fans, so if you're going to use them, you can plug them into here rather than using this header. And we've also got a SATA power connector which will plug into our power supply. We're now ready to install our power supply, and although it is fully modular, I've gone ahead and plugged the cables in that we're going to need. So we've got a 24-pin connector, a single PCIe cable which has 2 6+2 pin connectors, which is exactly what our graphics card is going to need. We've got an 8-pin EPS cable, and we've got a SATA cable because our case is going to need SATA power. So we can set our power supply into place, and importantly we're going to want to have the fan facing out the way. Then we're going to want to use 4 of these larger screws to secure the power supply into place. Make sure the switch in your power supply is turned on. Then we're going to need to plug in the extension cable for the power supply. I'm then going to route our 8-pin EPS cable down behind the power supply, along to the bottom, and get it plugged into this header down at the bottom. I'm then going to tuck the excess cable around the back of the power supply down at the bottom. I'm going to plug the SATA cable coming from our case into our SATA power supply cable. And then I'm going to tuck all the cables in behind the power supply. I'm also going to tuck the ARGB cable we're not going to be plugging in at the back behind the power supply as well. And then going to pass our 24-pin cable through and get it plugged in to place. Again, I'm just going to route the power supply cable in behind the power supply. And we've got a Velcro clip at the top to help manage the cable. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so I'm going to remove the expansion slot covers. I'm just going to remove all 3, even though we've got a dual slot card, because it is quite big and it will make fitting it easier, and then I can put the additional slot cover back on at the end. We can then open the clip on the riser cable, and then I'm going to insert our graphics card into place. That's it lowered in. I'm then going to line it up at the bottom with the riser cable. Once I'm happy it's lined up with the riser cable, it's just a little bit of firm pressure on the top to get it secured into place, and the clip on the riser cable will close. I'm then going to secure the graphics card into place with the 2 thumb screws we removed earlier on, and replace our 3rd expansion slot cover. We can then plug our PCIe cables into the graphics card. And then again, just to kind of tidy the cables up behind the power supply, and we've got another Velcro strap to help organise the cables. We're now ready to work on the I/O, and the first thing is to set our fans onto the radiator. Now importantly, we're going to want our I/O exhausting at the top, which is the right way round, and we're going to want all our cables coming out the motherboard side of the case, which is as they are now. Next, we're going to want to take our case's top bracket and pass our pump through the bracket, and then lower the bracket down. We're then going to want to pass our long radiator screws through the bracket, through the fans and into the radiator. Next, I'm going to bring all the cables coming from our fans and pass them up through this cutout here. Okay, so coming from each of our fans, we've got 2 wires. We've got a 4-pin PWM fan connector, and we've also got a 3-pin 5-volt ARGB connector. We'll start off with the PWM connectors, and what we're going to do is we're going to plug them into the double splitter cable that comes with our AIO. Then we're going to plug the other end into our CPU fan header on the motherboard. Also with our AIO, we get this triple ARGB splitter cable. So we're going to go ahead and plug the cables coming from our fans into the splitter cable. And another nice thing that could or MasterLiquid is this little bracket that goes over the top. And this just prevents the connection coming loose. Same thing with our other fan. And then you'll notice we've got 1 spare ARGB connector that's left. If you take a look at the wires coming from our pump, we've got an ARGB connector coming from the pump, so it's going to go into the additional cable here. And we've also got another 4-pin PWM connector, and that's going to go into our AIO header on the motherboard. The other end of our ARGB connector, we've got a choice. We can plug it into our motherboard, but because we're actually going to use the case to control all the lighting, the simplest thing is to plug this into the ARGB connector coming from our case. We can then set our top bracket onto the case and lower it down. So one of the nice things about this top bracket is we're actually going to be able to lift it up and down to help route our cables. So what I'm going to do now is pass our ARGB cable and our PWM cables behind the power supply. So next I'm going to lift our EPS cable up out of the way, and I can't get you a great shot of it, but we've got our CPU fan header furthest to the right, and then our AIO header furthest to the left down the bottom of the motherboard. So we'll plug the triple splitter cable into the CPU fan header, and also the cable coming from our pump into the pump header. Next I'm going to add some thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. I'm then going to lower our CPU cooler into place. Now importantly, I have removed the plastic protection from the CPU cooler because I've used it before. If this is your first time using it, make sure you remove the plastic protection. And then we're going to secure it into place with 4 thumb screws. Next, I want to plug the RGB cable coming from our pump into our triple splitter cable, and again we'll put the little plastic cover on to prevent it coming loose. Then we're going to plug the other end of our RGB splitter cable into our cases cable. All that remains to do is to tuck our RGB cable in behind our power supply. So that's the PC up and running, and I think it looks absolutely great. I really love the infinity mirror on the front. I've gone ahead and set the PC up. I haven't recorded those steps, but if you need to know how to install Windows, get any programs and drivers we're going to need, set up the RGB software, check out my Liandi O11 Dynamic Evo build guide. In that build guide I used another ASUS motherboard with exactly the same CPU, exactly the same RAM, and the process for setting up the ASUS motherboards is exactly the same. The only thing that will be slightly different is the software for controlling the graphics card, because I use a different graphics card in that build. So you're going to need to get your software from Zotac's website. You'll find a link to it in the description, and really the process for using it is really straightforward to change the RGB effects on the graphics card to whatever you'd like. The process for adjusting the RGB using the buttons at the front of the case was really straightforward. As I mentioned at the start, there's 2 buttons, one for mode and one for colour. By pressing the mode, you cycle through the various RGB effects, and then if you want to use the colour one, you'll be able to cycle through the different colours. To turn off the lighting, all you need to do is hold the mode button for 3 seconds, and then if you touch the mode button again, it will turn it back on. And I do think it was a good idea to plug our AIO into the case's lighting, because whenever we press the buttons on the front of the case, we're not only changing the lighting on the infinity mirror, but also the lighting on the AIO. So in terms of building in the case, everything was really straightforward. The Phanteks instruction manual is second to none, and I give you some great tips for managing the cables. I think really the only difficulties I had was that once I had managed the EPS cable at the bottom, access to the CPU fan header and the AIO pump header was a little bit difficult, and you had to move the cable up. So plugging those cables in was a little bit tricky, but not impossible. So what I would recommend is definitely the splitter cable for the CPU fan header, plug it in at the start. The other thing that was a little bit tricky was managing the AIO triple splitter cable for the RGB. And again, if I was doing this again, what I would do is probably route that cable at the start. Or the other thing that I might actually make the main routing in the case slightly better is actually have the cable routed up at the top, and then only actually bring the single bit from the splitter cable down into the main body of the case. The other option, of course, is to not actually plug any of the RGB in and avoid that cable. I just struggled a little bit once everything was in the build with managing that cable behind the power supply, because there wasn't any additional space. So moving on to the temperatures, our CPU idled at 41 degrees and reached a maximum 94 degrees during the 10-minute AIDA64 stability test. Our GPU idled at 49 degrees and reached a maximum of 69 degrees during the AIDA64 stability test. Noise levels were an average of 33 decibels at idle and 51 decibels under load. So because the temperatures were a little bit higher than what I was expecting, I decided to run the same tests again, but this time not have any of the panels on. So comparing the temperatures, our CPU idled 6 degrees cooler and was a whopping 11 degrees cooler during the ASUS64 stability test. GPU temperatures came down by 3 degrees both at idle and under load, and there was no difference to the noise levels. To put those results into context, we can compare the temperatures to my SUP build, where I used the same CPU cooler, however a different GPU. So in the SUP our CPU idled 11 degrees cooler, while it was 20 degrees cooler during the ASUS64 stability test, and obviously we can't compare the GPU temperatures given that it was a different GPU. So putting everything together, the Phanteks Evolv XT is an absolutely stunning case in terms of the aesthetics. It's really well designed using premium materials and is really straightforward to build in. The only negative about it for me is the temperatures. They're definitely higher than what I would expect and what you can get in another small form factor case, the SUP. The fact that this build was louder than the SUP isn't a surprise because it's running significantly hotter and the fans are going to ramp up in compensation for that. So would I recommend you getting this case? And I think it depends what's most important to you and what system you're planning on putting together in it. If aesthetics are the most important thing to you, I don't think you can argue this case looks absolutely stunning. Compared to the SUP, this one looks so much better and the materials definitely feel much more premium. In terms of the temperatures, there's no comparison. The SUP is a much better case in terms of thermals, in terms of noise. So I think it depends what sort of system you're planning on putting into it. If you're going with a high-end system, I don't think I can recommend this case because the temperatures are going to be a little bit higher than what I would be happy with. It is, however, important to say that the ASUS64 stability test is a pretty extreme test, but the other thing that is important to note is that our idle temperatures when the system wasn't under a lot of stress were significantly higher as well. Now, the one advantage of this system is if you are going to go with less premium components, you're not going to see them. The fact that you've got these panels and mesh on the side, the build is going to look the same if you've gone with a budget system versus a high-end system. So I think for a budget to mid-end system, this case will look absolutely brilliant, but I would worry about putting a high-end system in this case. So hopefully you have found this build guide useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. If you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.